Hello and welcome to Philosophy Over Tea, the podcast where you can join me on my journey as I explore various major facets of philosophy. Hosted by myself, Sahir, Philosophy Over Tea will take you through major philosophical concepts, exploring different philosophers, essential texts, and even future technologies along the way in an easy-to-understand, casual manner. In today's episode, we take a look at the idea of free will, what it actually is, why it's significant, and various arguments for or against free will. Before diving into the episode, I wanted to first take a look at the direction that this podcast will be going in. Instead of being a rather instructional resource, as I had mentioned in the pilot, I think this podcast would be more beneficial as more of a discussion, where I explain my journey and my ideas as I explore different concepts in philosophy. As I am just a beginner student of philosophy, I think this would be a more beneficial take on the podcast, both for myself and for you, the listeners. I appreciate all the support that came in the first episode, and I look forward to entertaining you guys in the future. Now, without further ado, let's jump right into it. So what actually is free will? Well, free will is basically what we want to have, most people at least, when we go out and we buy something from the store, or when we decide to read a book or watch a movie. We always think in our daily lives that we are making these decisions. But are we really? The debate on free will has lasted thousands of years, ranging from Aristotle all the way to today's philosophers, and it will probably never have a definitive answer, as many debates in philosophy do. When an animal makes a decision, so to speak, for example, when a lion chases after and hunts down and eats a gazelle, we don't say that they decided to do that. We often say that that was in their nature, to hunt down and kill that animal. They did it out of necessity because they have to kill in order to survive. However, when humans make certain decisions, such as deciding to watch a movie rather than studying for that final you have a few days from now, we say that those decisions were made by us. We take for granted that we had the decision to do otherwise. And this is essentially what is known as free will, though this phrase is used in other contexts as well. An act is thus considered free if one has the power to act otherwise. Before an agent carries out an act, their psychological and biological states are set. For non-human animals, we usually say that this prior state determines what they do next, and we can use that state to predict what they do next. By contrast, for humans, we usually only say that they are strongly inclined towards a certain thing based on their psychological and biological factors, but we ultimately say that the decision is up to the agent themselves when they are a human. According to this free will hypothesis, that is why humans are normally responsible for what they do, but animals are not considered responsible for what they do. So let's break this free will hypothesis down further. We've seen that a person is only responsible for an action if they had the power to do otherwise. But another condition here is a control condition, where a person is responsible for an action if they determine that action themselves. Now, to illustrate this, let's look at another example. Say you went into a grocery store and bought some wonderful chocolate. Now that would be a free decision according to this control principle if you had made that decision freely and you had not been coerced into it by someone else. Now, taken together, these two conditions entail that a person is responsible for an action only if their choice was not determined by previous factors that you had no control over. But humans generally think that people are responsible for what they do. So typical human choices cannot be determined by these prior factors. And so we come to the free will hypothesis, that we do have free will and our actions are not controlled by things that come before us, at least not entirely. Now, looking introspectively, this makes sense. Consider how you feel when you go to the grocery store and buy a box of chocolates. You do feel as though you are making that decision. However, looking at psychological and neuroscience data, there is no evidence to actually suggest that our actions are free. everything seems to be determined by neural connections, by the process and the journey of neurons through your brains. And as it turns out, we at the conscious level do not have any control over that. So how can we possibly say that we are responsible for our actions if we cannot control the factors that presuppose them in our brain? When first learning about the concepts of free will and the various arguments, the first major thing to learn about for me was determinism versus indeterminism. Now, determinism states that all the facts at a certain time t, including one's environment, one's heredity, one's psychological state, and many other factors, together with a statement of the laws of nature, such as those of gravity and time, will logically entail what will happen at any future time t plus n. Now, this essentially states that an omniscient being that has all the facts at this current time will be able to accurately predict what happens at any future time. And it also means that everything you do and everything you will do has already been determined, as the word determinism suggests. Indeterminism is the opposite of determinism, and states that the current state can in no way predict accurately what will happen in the future. It essentially just gives probabilities to things that could happen, but it doesn't set in stone what will happen at a certain point. But what I find most fascinating is the next part, known as the dilemma of determinism. The dilemma of determinism shows that regardless of whether determinism or indeterminism is true, we still don't have free choice. We still aren't responsible for what we do. Now, how did we come to that conclusion? Well, let's look at this through an example. Consider that there is a burglar who breaks into a house, steals the things in there, and then leaves. Now, suppose that the situation of determinism is true in today's world. Looking at the burglary case, we would say that that person's psychological and biological state before he broke into the house determined that he would definitely break in, steal what he did, and then leave. Human freedom is essentially an illusion then, since every action is determined, and thus that burglar is not responsible for what they did. Now let's take a look at if indeterminism is true. Right before the robber broke in, he would have had a certain psychological and biological state. However, that state did not in any way influence his decision to break into the house and steal the various things around him. Now, if it's just pure chance and he didn't choose it in any way, how can we still say that someone is responsible for that? Well, as it stands, we can't, because it was just random chance that he broke in. It could have been just as likely that he didn't break in. And once again, this applies to every single human action. So how is indeterminism better than determinism at all? And thus, we arrive at the dilemma of determinism. If determinism is true, we are not responsible, since our choices are determined by factors over which we have no control. If indeterminism is true, we are not responsible, since our choices are pure chance occurrences. Now, either determinism is true or indeterminism is true. Therefore, either way, we are not morally responsible for what we do. This dilemma of determinism is a profound and big issue for those who argue that we are in fact morally responsible for what we do. In order to combat this, there have been many strategies developed. Philosophers such as Ayer, Harry Frankfurt, and P.F. Strawson all come from a school of thought known as compatibilism, which reject the idea that determinism means that you cannot be morally responsible for what you do. They argue that there can be a deterministic circumstance in which your actions are predetermined, but yet you are still morally responsible for what you do. And we'll explore these ideas in further episodes of this podcast. Some philosophers also suggest that while human freedom might be an illusion, it is an illusion that is unshakable and therefore still significant. To see why this is unshakable, try a small experiment. The next time you turn on the news and read about a politician who lies to a bunch of people, or see someone who has murdered someone else or robbed someone's house, try to tell yourself that no, they don't deserve to be punished for what they did, because, well, for all we know, their actions were predetermined by something else. And you will see why this illusion of human freedom is still a significant one that should be paid attention to. Now, you've listened to me talk about free will for the past 10 minutes or so. But why is this debate so important? Well, one of the key reasons why this is important is because of a phrase that I've thrown around a few times during this episode: moral responsibility. Suppose you turn on the news tonight and you see that someone has shot a woman in the head. Now, this act would not be considered a tragedy, as it would have been if, say, an animal had escaped the zoo and eaten this woman. No, we considered this act to be a moral wrong. In other words, we say that the person who did the killing is morally responsible for this act. And this case is not just a one-off. It is a common conception to humans that we are responsible for what we do. We make a decision, we carry out an action, and we face the consequences of it. As a society, we take it for granted that we can punish people for their actions. We can punish some, reward others for their actions. But how can we justifiably punish people if they don't truly have free will? If they're not the ones making their decisions, why should they be punished for it? If, say, that burglar that we spoke about earlier, if he was influenced by his environment, by the state of his brain, and other factors, how can we possibly punish him for breaking and entering and stealing the things he did? And conversely, how can we praise people for the good they do if it wasn't their decisions that caused them to do it? We take this for granted that we make decisions. And we often think that it is one of the most important differences between us and other non-human animals, that we can make decisions that we are responsible for. But if this is the case, then there must be something special about humans. Something that allows us to be responsible for what we do, and not just have it predetermined by something else. And that is what this hotly debated idea attempts to answer. What makes us special to have free will, if we have it at all? While reading about these, I sort of came upon this idea that even though we are not responsible for what we do, it might still be justified to punish people for what they do. A way that I rationalize this is by thinking that watching others be punished is part of the environment, is part of one's environment, and if they see that, then they might be less inclined towards doing the things that can get them punished, towards doing things that are immoral and not just. This is simply one of the ways that these things are justified, that these things are argued, and there are obviously many, many more, as we will explore in further episodes. Another key argument in this vein, as was mentioned earlier, is known as compatibilism, which essentially argues that deterministic worldviews do not mean that we cannot be morally responsible. Compatibilists believe that once we get a clear idea on what we really mean by free will, we will see that having free will is perfectly compatible with a deterministic worldview. They argue that the opposite of free action is not just determined action, but rather coerced action or compelled action. A famous example of this is David Hume, who argues that the fact that you are causally determined to do something does not necessarily mean that you did not want it or that you did not choose to do it. And thus, it is possible for a compatibilist worldview in which determinism and free will are true. That is where we're going to leave the episode for today. Thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope you have an incredible day. See you in the next one.